The dust kicked up by the wagon wheels created a thick cloud that seemed to follow the small convoy like a persistent shadow. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her pale skin. The journey from Santa Fe had been long and treacherous, but nothing could have prepared her family for what lay ahead on this scorching afternoon in 1847. Her father, Miguel Martinez, gripped the reins tighter as he noticed the horses becoming restless. The animals sensed something that the humans had not yet detected. Behind him, his wife Carmen clutched their youngest daughter close to her chest, while their two sons rode alongside on horseback, rifles ready but inexperienced hands trembling slightly. Sarah, at 19, was the eldest of the Martinez children. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and her brown eyes constantly scanned the horizon. She had inherited her mother's beauty and her father's strong will, a combination that had already brought her attention from several young men back in their former town. But those days seemed like a distant memory now as they traveled toward what they hoped would be a new beginning in California. The family had left everything behind after Miguel lost their small ranch to debt. The promise of gold and fertile land in California had drawn thousands westward, and the Martinez family was no different. They carried their entire life in two wagons, along with their neighbors, the Johnson family, who had become close friends during the preparation for this journey. Thomas Johnson rode at the front, his weathered face constantly alert. His wife Mary sat beside him, their three children tucked safely in the wagon bed. The two families had pooled their resources and planned to start a new life together, perhaps even combining their efforts to establish a successful ranch once they reached their destination. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving. Red rock formations jutted up from the desert floor like ancient sentinels, and the sparse vegetation offered little relief from the relentless sun. Water was becoming scarce, and they knew they would need to reach the next water source before nightfall. The map they carried showed a small creek just a few miles ahead, nestled in a canyon that would provide both water and shelter for the night. As they approached the canyon entrance, Miguel felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. The horses were now openly nervous, snorting and tossing their heads. Even the oxen pulling the wagons seemed reluctant to continue forward. Sarah noticed her father's tension and moved her horse closer to the wagon. "Papa, what is it?" she asked in Spanish, though the family often spoke English now as they tried to fit in with their new country. "I don't know, mija," Miguel replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "but something doesn't feel right." Thomas Johnson had noticed the change in atmosphere as well. He raised his hand to signal a halt, and the small convoy stopped at the mouth of the canyon. The silence was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of the animals and the creaking of leather and wood. The canyon walls rose high on either side, casting long shadows across the narrow passage. What should have been a welcome relief from the sun now felt ominous and threatening. Sarah dismounted from her horse and walked to the edge of the canyon, peering down at the rocky path that led to the water source they desperately needed. "We have to go through," Thomas said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "The horses need water and we're running low ourselves." Carmen spoke up from the wagon, her voice tight with worry. "Can't we find another way?" "This place feels like death itself." But Miguel shook his head. "We've come too far to turn back now. The next water source is 3 days away and we don't have supplies to last that long." He looked around at his family, then at the Johnsons. "We stick together and we move quickly. No stopping until we reach the creek." The decision made, they began their descent into the canyon. The wagon wheels echoed off the rock walls, creating an eerie sound that seemed to amplify with each turn. Sarah rode beside the lead wagon, her rifle across her lap, though she had never fired it at anything more dangerous than a rabbit. Halfway through the canyon, Thomas suddenly pulled his wagon to a halt. In front of them, blocking the narrow path, were 3 Apache warriors on horseback. Their faces were painted with war paint, and their weapons were drawn. Behind them, Sarah could see more warriors emerging from hidden positions among the rocks. The leader of the Apache group was a man in his 30s, tall and muscular, with long black hair adorned with feathers and beads. His chest was bare except for a leather vest, and his arms were decorated with traditional tattoos that spoke of his victories in battle. His horse, a beautiful paint stallion, pranced nervously as he studied the group of travelers. Miguel's hands trembled as he reached for his rifle, but Thomas quickly motioned for him to stop. "Don't make any sudden moves," he whispered. "Maybe we can negotiate." The Apache leader spoke in his native language, his voice carrying easily through the canyon. Though none of the travelers understood his words, his tone was clear. They were not welcome here. This was Apache territory and they were trespassers. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest as she looked around at the warriors surrounding them. She counted at least 12, all armed with bows, rifles, and traditional weapons. Their faces were hard and determined, showing no mercy for the frightened families trapped in their canyon. One of the younger Apache warriors pointed at the wagons and spoke rapidly to his leader. Sarah noticed his gaze lingering on her, and she instinctively pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. The leader's eyes followed his warrior's gesture, and his expression changed slightly as he studied the young woman. Carmen began to pray quietly in Spanish, her voice barely audible but filled with desperation. The children in both wagons remained silent, sensing the danger even if they didn't fully understand it. The youngest Johnson boy began to whimper, but his mother quickly hushed him with a gentle hand. The Apache leader raised his bow, an arrow notched and ready. His eyes moved from one family member to another, as if deciding their fate. The other warriors followed his lead, their own weapons raised and aimed at the trapped travelers. In that moment, Sarah realized that their new life in California might end before it had even begun. The promise of gold and prosperity seemed meaningless now, faced with the reality of survival in a land where they were clearly not wanted. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of her own, asking for protection for her family and hoping that somehow they might find a way out of this desperate situation. The standoff continued as the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, casting longer shadows and deeper fears into the hearts of all involved. The tension in the canyon grew thicker than the desert heat as both groups remained frozen in their standoff. The Apache leader, whose name was Ayana in his native tongue, studied each member of the traveling party with calculated precision. His dark eyes held the wisdom of someone who had survived countless raids and battles, but also the hardness of a man who had lost too much to trust easily. Behind him, his warriors waited for his signal. They had been tracking this group for 2 days, watching from the high ridges as the wagons made their slow progress across Apache land. These were not the first settlers to attempt passage through their territory, and previous encounters had not ended well for either side. Thomas Johnson slowly raised his hands, showing that he held no weapon. His voice cracked as he attempted to speak. "We mean no harm. We're just passing through to California. We have water, food, supplies we can share." Ayana understood more English than he let on. Years of trading with Mexican settlers and occasional dealings with American travelers had taught him the language, though he rarely revealed this knowledge. He listened to Thomas's words but showed no change in expression. Miguel Martinez found his courage and spoke up as well. "Por favor, we have children. Take what you want, but let our families pass safely." His broken English mixed with Spanish as fear clouded his thoughts. The Apache leader's gaze moved across the group again, but this time it stopped and lingered on Sarah. She sat straight in her saddle, her chin lifted despite the fear in her eyes. Unlike the others, she did not look away from his steady stare. There was something in her bearing that caught his attention, a strength that reminded him of the women of his own tribe. Sarah felt the weight of the warrior's gaze and forced herself to remain calm. She had heard stories of Apache raids, of women and children taken captive, but she had also heard tales of their honor and their complex code of warfare. Her grandfather had once told her that courage, even in the face of death, was often the only thing that could earn respect from an enemy. One of the younger Apache warriors, called Nalnish, rode closer to Ayana and spoke rapidly in their language. Sarah caught fragments of their conversation, not understanding the words but recognizing the urgency in the young man's voice. He pointed toward the canyon entrance and she realized he might be warning of other travelers or perhaps soldiers approaching. Ayana raised his hand to silence his warrior, then made a decision that surprised everyone. He guided his horse forward, stopping just a few feet from the lead wagon. His bow remained ready, but he lowered it slightly as he spoke in clear, accented English. "You travel Apache land without permission. This canyon is sacred to my people. Your wagons disturb the spirits of our ancestors." Thomas and Miguel exchanged glances, surprised by the warrior's fluency. Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "We didn't know. We're following maps given to us in Santa Fe. We meant no disrespect to your ancestors or your land. Maps made by men who do not own this land, Ayana replied, his voice carrying both anger and sadness. White men and Mexicanos draw lines on paper, claim what was never theirs to claim. Sarah listened to this exchange and felt something shift inside her. This was not the savage warrior she had expected from the stories she had heard. His words carried the weight of generations of injustice, and despite her fear, she found herself understanding his anger. Carmen Martinez whispered desperately to her husband in Spanish, begging him to give the Apache whatever they wanted if it would spare their children's lives. The youngest Martinez child, only 7 years old, began to cry softly, which made the horses more nervous and the situation more volatile. Ayana heard the child's tears, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had children of his own in the village, though they had been moved to safety in the mountains while his war party dealt with the increasing number of travelers crossing their territory. "You bring sickness to our land," he continued, gesturing toward the wagons. "Your people take our water, hunt our game, cut our trees. Soon there will be nothing left for Apache children." Sarah surprised herself by speaking up. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Then what would you have us do?" "We cannot go back. We have nothing left behind us." Ayana turned his full attention to her, and for a moment the canyon fell silent except for the wind whistling through the rocks. The other Apache warriors watched their leader carefully, knowing that his next decision would determine whether this encounter ended in bloodshed or something else entirely. "You speak with courage, woman," Ayana said finally. "What is your name?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied, ignoring her father's sharp intake of breath at her boldness. "Sarah Martinez," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "You are not afraid to die?" Sarah looked around at her family, at the Johnson children huddled in their wagon, at her mother's tear-streaked face. "I am afraid," she answered honestly, "but not for myself. These people are innocent. They seek only a chance at a new life." Nalnish spoke again to his leader, more urgently this time. Through gestures and the few words Sarah could make out, she understood that there were indeed other travelers approaching, possibly a larger group that might include soldiers or traders with better weapons. Ayana made a sharp gesture, and several of his warriors began to retreat to higher positions in the canyon walls. The tactical move was clear. If a fight became necessary, they would have the advantage of height and cover. But the movement also suggested that he was considering options other than immediate violence. "Your men," Ayana said, pointing to Miguel and Thomas. "They are weak. They would not survive one winter in Apache land. But you," he looked at Sarah again, "you have the spirit of a survivor." Thomas Johnson made a desperate attempt at negotiation. "We have trade goods, silver coins, tools. Whatever you want, it's yours. Just let us pass peacefully." But Ayana was no longer interested in their material possessions. His attention remained fixed on Sarah, as if he was calculating something in his mind. The other Apache warriors seemed to understand their leader's thoughts, and several exchanged knowing glances. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, growing louder by the minute. The approaching group would arrive within the hour, and Ayana knew he had to make his decision quickly. His war party was strong, but if the newcomers were soldiers or a large, well-armed trading company, a battle in the confined space of the canyon could result in heavy losses for his people. Sarah sensed the urgency of the moment and made a decision that would change everything. She dismounted from her horse and took several steps toward the Apache leader, her hands visible and empty of weapons. "If letting my family pass safely requires a price," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon, "then name it, but spare the children. They have done nothing wrong." Ayana studied her face, seeing something in her expression that reminded him of his own sister, who had died defending their village from soldiers 3 summers ago. The courage in Sarah's eyes was not the reckless bravery of someone with nothing to lose, but the determined sacrifice of someone who would give everything to protect those she loved. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and dust clouds appeared at the canyon's entrance. Ayana's sharp eyes counted at least 15 riders, heavily armed and moving with military precision. These were not simple travelers like the families before him, but professional soldiers or experienced traders who would not hesitate to fight their way through Apache territory. Sarah remained standing in the open space between the two groups, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. She could see the conflict in Ayana's expression as he weighed his options. Behind her, she heard her father whisper her name desperately, begging her to return to safety. But she held her ground. Nalnish rode close to his leader and spoke in rapid Apache. Sarah caught enough of his gestures to understand that he was reporting the strength of the approaching force and recommending an immediate retreat to higher ground. But retreat would mean leaving the canyon and its precious water source, something the Apache could not afford to lose during the harsh summer months. Ayana made a series of hand signals to his warriors, and they began to position themselves strategically throughout the canyon. Some moved to concealed positions among the rocks while others prepared to flank the entrance. It was clear that he had decided to make a stand, but the tactical situation was far from ideal. "Your people bring soldiers to Apache land," Ayana said to Sarah, his voice carrying accusation and anger. "This is why we cannot trust the words of settlers. You speak of peace while your armies follow behind." Sarah shook her head emphatically. "Those aren't our soldiers. We don't even know who they are. We've been traveling alone for weeks trying to avoid military patrols and trading posts. We want nothing to do with the army or the government." Thomas Johnson, desperate to support Sarah's words, called out from his wagon. "She speaks the truth. We left Santa Fe to get away from the territorial governor and his taxes. We're not allies of the soldiers. We're just families trying to survive." The lead rider of the approaching group appeared at the canyon entrance, confirming Sarah's worst fears. It was Captain William Morrison of the Territorial Militia, a man known for his harsh treatment of Apache tribes and his ruthless efficiency in clearing Native American populations from valuable land. Behind him rode a mixed group of soldiers and civilian volunteers, all heavily armed and looking for trouble. Morrison's voice boomed through the canyon as he assessed the situation. Well, what have we here? Looks like some settlers have gotten themselves into a predicament with the local savages." Sarah felt her blood run cold at his mocking tone. She had heard stories about Morrison's methods, how he would use settlers as bait to draw Apache warriors into ambushes, then claim the land for the territory. His presence here was no coincidence. Ayana's expression hardened as he recognized the captain. Morrison had been responsible for the massacre at Blue Creek 2 years earlier, where dozens of Apache women and children had been killed while the men were away hunting. The hatred between the two men was personal and deadly. "Captain Morrison," Ayana called out in English, his voice carrying across the canyon, "you are not welcome in Apache territory. Turn back now and no blood will be spilled today." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "I don't take orders from Redskins, Chief. These settlers are under the protection of the territorial government, and I'm here to see them safely through your land." Sarah realized with growing horror that Morrison's arrival had changed everything. What might have been resolved through negotiation or even tribute was now heading toward inevitable bloodshed. The captain's presence made compromise impossible, as his reputation depended on his ruthless treatment of Native American tribes. Miguel Martinez finally found his courage and called out to his daughter. "Sarah, please come back to the wagon. This is not your fight." But Sarah understood something that her father did not. Morrison's arrival meant that her family was now caught between two forces that would show them no mercy. The captain would use them as human shields if necessary, and would later claim that he had heroically rescued them from Apache savages. Their survival depended on finding a third option, something that neither Morrison nor traditional Apache warfare could provide. She looked directly at Ayana and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I know who that man is. Captain Morrison killed Apache families at Blue Creek. He's not here to protect us. He's here to use us as an excuse to attack your people." Morrison's face twisted with rage at her accusation. "Shut your mouth, girl. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm here on official business and I won't be lectured by some ignorant settler woman." Ayana studied Sarah with new respect. Her willingness to speak the truth, even when it put her in danger from her own people, showed a courage that transcended cultural boundaries. He began to see a possibility that had not existed moments before. "You would speak against your own kind to defend Apache people?" Ayana asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and testing. Sarah nodded firmly. "I speak against murder and cruelty, no matter who commits it. My family seeks only safe passage and a chance at a new life. Captain Morrison seeks glory and death. There is a difference." Morrison spurred his horse forward, his hand on his sidearm. "That's enough out of you. All settlers will fall in behind my men immediately. We're going to clear these savages out of this canyon once and for all." The Mexican families exchanged terrified glances. They understood that following Morrison's orders would make them complicit in what would likely become a massacre, but refusing would make them targets of his anger as well. Nelnish and several other Apache warriors moved closer to Ayana, awaiting orders. The tactical situation was becoming impossible. Morrison's force was too large to defeat in direct combat, especially with innocent families caught in the crossfire, but retreat would mean abandoning sacred ground and accepting the continued encroachment on Apache territory. Sarah made a decision that shocked everyone present. She walked directly toward Ayana, stopping within arm's reach of his horse. Her voice carried clearly to both groups as she spoke. "You said I have the spirit of a survivor. Prove it. Take me as your captive. Demand that Morrison and his men leave Apache territory in exchange for my safe return. Give my family time to escape, and give your warriors time to choose their battlefield." Miguel Martinez cried out in anguish at his daughter's words, but Sarah continued speaking to Ayana, her eyes never leaving his face. "I am offering myself willingly, not as a victim but as a bridge between our peoples. Morrison cannot claim victory if there is no battle, and your people cannot be blamed for protecting their sacred sites from invasion." The canyon fell silent except for the nervous stamping of horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Morrison's face showed confusion at this unexpected development, while Ayana's warriors looked to their leader for guidance. Ayana saw the wisdom in Sarah's proposal, but also its dangers. Taking a settler woman hostage, even willingly, would bring the full weight of territorial forces down upon his people. But allowing Morrison to use the families as an excuse for attack would result in immediate bloodshed and the loss of the sacred canyon. The Apache leader made his choice. Knowing it would change the course of events for both peoples, he reached down and extended his hand toward Sarah, his expression grave but determined. Sarah looked at Ayana's outstretched hand and understood that this moment would define not only her fate, but the fate of everyone in the canyon. The weight of her decision pressed down upon her like the desert heat, but she could see no other path that might spare innocent lives on both sides. Behind her, she heard her mother's anguished sob and her father's desperate pleas. "Sarah, no. There must be another way. Please, Mija, don't do this." But Sarah had already made peace with her choice. She placed her hand in Ayana's strong grip, feeling the calluses earned through years of warfare and survival. His skin was warm and surprisingly gentle as he helped her mount behind him on his painted stallion. "You are brave, Sarah Martinez," he said quietly, so only she could hear. But bravery and wisdom are not always the same thing. Captain Morrison's voice exploded across the canyon, filled with rage and disbelief. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Release that woman immediately, or I'll hang every last one of you savages from the nearest tree." Ayana turned his horse to face Morrison directly, Sarah's arms instinctively wrapping around his waist to keep her balance. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of Apache leaders. "The woman comes willingly to prevent bloodshed. She will be treated with honor according to Apache law. You will leave our sacred canyon immediately, and the families will be allowed to continue their journey. This is our offer of peace." Morrison's face turned purple with fury. "I don't negotiate with redskins. You have 5 minutes to release that woman, or I'll come in there and take her back myself." Sarah felt Ayana's muscles tense at the captain's words, and she could sense the barely controlled anger of the Apache warriors around them. The insult to their leader was also an insult to their entire people, and she knew that Morrison was pushing them toward exactly the violent confrontation he claimed to want to prevent. "Captain Morrison," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite her fear. "I am not your prisoner, and these people are not your enemies. I have made my choice to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Honor that choice and let my family continue safely to California." Thomas Johnson, seeing an opportunity to defuse the situation, urged his wagon forward slightly. "Captain, the young lady has made her decision. Perhaps it would be wise to respect her wishes and focus on getting our families to safety." Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously as he studied the scene before him. Sarah could almost see his mind working, calculating the political implications of the situation. A heroic rescue of a settler woman from Apache captivity would enhance his reputation, but a failed attack that resulted in her death would destroy his career. Nalnish rode close to Ayana and spoke urgently in Apache. Sarah caught fragments of his words and realized he was reporting movement in the rocks above them. More Apache warriors were arriving, responding to signals that had been sent earlier. The tactical situation was shifting in their favor, but Sarah knew that Morrison was too proud to retreat without some face-saving gesture. "I propose a compromise," she said loudly, addressing both groups. "Captain Morrison, you can report that you successfully negotiated the safe passage of settler families through dangerous Apache territory. Chief Ayanna, you can demonstrate Apache honor by protecting a woman who sought your help to prevent bloodshed." Ayanna was impressed by her diplomatic thinking, but he knew that Morrison was not a man who appreciated compromise. The captain's reputation was built on decisive military action, not negotiated settlements. "The woman speaks wisely," Ayanna said, playing his role in Sarah's proposed solution. "Apache people have no quarrel with families seeking new homes. Our quarrel is with soldiers who bring war to sacred places." Morrison's lieutenant, a young man named Sergeant Collins, rode up beside his captain and spoke in a low voice. Sarah couldn't hear his words, but she could see him gesturing toward the rocks where Apache warriors were now clearly visible. The sergeant was obviously pointing out that they were now outnumbered, and in a tactically disadvantageous position. The Martinez family watched in agonized silence as their daughter sat calmly behind the Apache leader. Carmen had stopped crying, but her face was pale with shock and grief. Miguel gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles were white. But he understood that any aggressive action on his part would doom his daughter, and probably his entire family. Mary Johnson began to pray audibly, her voice carrying across the canyon as she asked for divine intervention. Her children remained hidden in the wagon bed, but Sarah could hear their frightened whispers and her heart ached for them. Ayanna made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own warriors. He guided his horse closer to the Martinez family's wagon and spoke directly to Miguel in Spanish. "Your daughter has great courage, Señor Martinez. She will be safe with my people. When the soldiers are gone, we will speak of her return." Miguel's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at his daughter. "Sarah, I should have protected you better. This is my fault for bringing the family into danger." Sarah reached out and briefly touched her father's weathered hand. "Papa, you gave us hope for a better life. That hope is worth protecting even at great cost. Take care of Mama and the little ones. I will see you again." Morrison finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This isn't over, Chief. The territorial government will hear about this. Kidnapping American citizens carries a death sentence, as does murdering Apache families," Ayanna replied coldly. "Your government's justice works in both directions." The standoff continued for several more tense minutes as Morrison weighed his options. Sarah could see him glancing between the Apache positions in the rocks and the narrow canyon entrance, where retreat would be difficult under fire. His military training was warring with his political ambitions, and she prayed that pragmatism would win. Finally, Sergeant Collins spoke up again, this time loudly enough for others to hear. "Captain, sir, we have accomplished our mission of ensuring the settlers' safe passage. Perhaps we should escort the families out of the canyon and return with a larger force if necessary." Morrison's face showed his internal struggle, but he eventually nodded curtly. "Very well, Sergeant. All settlers will form up behind our escort immediately. We're leaving this canyon." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as the immediate crisis began to resolve. Her gamble had worked, at least partially. The families would escape safely and the confrontation would end without bloodshed. But she also understood that her own ordeal was just beginning. As the wagons began to move toward the canyon entrance under Morrison's escort, Sarah looked back at her family one more time. Her mother was crying again, but she was also nodding with pride at her daughter's courage. Her father raised his hand in a gesture of blessing and farewell. "Be strong, mija," Miguel called out. "We will not forget you and we will not give up hope." The procession moved slowly through the canyon, the tension gradually easing as distance grew between the two groups. Morrison's men remained alert and ready for action, but the Apache warriors made no move to interfere with the departure. As the last dust cloud from Morrison's escort disappeared beyond the canyon entrance, an eerie silence settled over the sacred Apache grounds. Sarah found herself alone among warriors whose language she barely understood, whose customs were foreign to her, and whose reaction to her presence remained uncertain. Ayanna guided his horse to a sheltered area near the creek where ancient pictographs decorated the red sandstone walls. The drawings told stories of Apache ancestors, their hunting expeditions, spiritual visions, and battles fought to protect their homeland. Sarah studied the images with fascination, recognizing their deep cultural significance even without understanding their specific meanings. The other Apache warriors gathered in a loose circle around their leader, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Sarah caught fragments of the discussion and realized they were debating what to do with her. Some voices sounded angry, others concerned, and a few seemed almost amused by the unprecedented situation. Nalnish, the young warrior who had served as scout and advisor, approached Ayana and spoke directly to him while gesturing toward Sarah. His tone suggested disagreement with his leader's decision to accept her offer. Sarah understood enough of his body language to realize he was questioning the wisdom of taking a settler woman into their community. Nalnish believes I have made a mistake, Ayana explained to Sarah in English. He thinks accepting your offer brings more danger than it prevents. Sarah met the young warrior's skeptical gaze directly. What would he have preferred? A battle in the canyon that might have killed warriors, settlers, and soldiers? Sometimes preventing war requires taking risks. Ayana translated her words and Nalnish's expression softened slightly. He spoke again, this time with less hostility, and Sarah could see him considering her perspective. He asked if you understand what you have committed yourself to. Ayana continued. Apache captives become part of the tribe or they do not survive. There is no middle ground. The weight of her decision began to settle more fully upon Sarah's shoulders. In her desperation to save her family and prevent bloodshed, she had not fully considered what life among the Apache would actually entail. The stories she had heard ranged from tales of brutal slavery to accounts of captives who had eventually found acceptance and even happiness in their new lives. I understand, she replied, though her voice carried more confidence than she felt. I knew the risks when I made the choice. I'm prepared to face whatever comes. One of the older warriors, a man whose weathered face bore the scars of many battles, rode forward and spoke at length to Ayana. His tone was respectful but firm, and Sarah sensed that he was voicing concerns about bringing an outsider into their village during such tense times. Ayana listened carefully to the elder's words before responding. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding their voices to the discussion. Sarah sat quietly, understanding that her fate was being decided through this democratic process that seemed to give every warrior a chance to speak. Finally, Ayana turned back to her with a grave expression. Machete, our war leader, reminds us that your people and mine are at war. Taking you to our village puts our families at risk if soldiers come searching. He asks why we should trust the word of a settler woman. Sarah had anticipated this question and had spent the time during their discussion preparing her answer. Because I chose to place myself in your hands rather than let Captain Morrison use my family as an excuse for massacre. Because I spoke the truth about his crimes against your people, even when it put me in danger. Because I am asking for nothing except the chance to prove that not all settlers are your enemies. Her words were translated, and she could see them having an impact on the assembled warriors. The concept of a white woman defending Apache rights against her own people was clearly difficult for them to process. But it also intrigued them. Machete, the scarred war leader, spoke again, this time directing his words to Sarah in broken English. You say not enemy, prove. How you prove? Sarah looked around at the faces watching her intently. These were men who had spent their lives fighting to protect their families and their way of life from encroaching settlers and soldiers. They had every reason to distrust her, and she had only her actions to demonstrate her sincerity. I can prove it by sharing what I know about military movements in the territory, she said. My father heard Captain Morrison talking to other officers in Santa Fe. They're planning a major campaign against Apache settlements in the autumn. I can tell you where they plan to attack and when. This information caused an immediate stir among the warriors. Military intelligence was invaluable for planning defensive strategies and protecting civilian populations. If Sarah's knowledge was accurate, it could save many Apache lives. Ayana's expression showed both interest and suspicion. How do we know this information is true? How do we know this is not a trap to make us trust you? Sarah had expected this question as well. Because if I were working with Captain Morrison, I would have found a way to signal his men before they left the canyon. Because the information I can give you will help you protect your people, not harm them, and because I am here among you, with no way to escape if you decide I have betrayed your trust. The logic of her argument was difficult to refute. Nalnish spoke again, this time with what sounded like grudging respect in his voice. Ayana nodded at his words and turned back to Sarah. Nalnish says that enemies do not usually place themselves at the mercy of those they wish to deceive. He believes we should test your knowledge before making final decisions about your fate. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. A test meant opportunity, but it also meant that failure could result in consequences she preferred not to contemplate. What kind of test? Machete answered in his halting English. You tell about soldiers, we check. If true, maybe you not enemy. If lies. He made a gesture across his throat that needed no translation. I understand, Sarah replied. Captain Morrison mentioned that Colonel Hayes is planning to establish 3 new forts along the Apache trail routes. One near Silver Creek, one at Eagles Pass, and one at the junction where the old Spanish Trail meets the California Road. He said construction would begin after the summer heat breaks, probably in late September. The warriors exchanged significant glances at this information. Sarah could tell from their reactions that these locations held strategic importance, probably controlling access to water sources and traditional hunting grounds. Ayana studied her face carefully. This Colonel Hayes, what else did Morrison say about him? He's supposed to arrive from Fort Union next month with 2 companies of cavalry and a regiment of engineers. Morrison was bragging that Hayes had given him authority to clear all Apache from the designated areas, using whatever methods he deemed necessary. The war leader Machete spoke rapidly to the other warriors, his voice filled with anger. Sarah didn't need translation to understand that this information confirmed their worst fears about military intentions in their territory. If this information proves accurate, Ayana said slowly, you will have given us great service. Apache scouts will check these places you mention. If soldiers are indeed preparing these forts, we will know you speak truth. An older woman emerged from behind the rocks where she had apparently been observing the entire exchange. Her gray hair was braided with silver ornaments, and her clothing marked her as someone of high status within the tribe. She walked directly to Ayana's horse and spoke to him in Apache, her tone suggesting both authority and concern. This is Nahasan, my mother, Ayana explained to Sarah. She says that the discussion of military matters is finished for now. She wishes to know what we plan to do with a settler woman who cannot cook Apache food, cannot speak Apache words, and cannot survive in Apache country. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to meet the older woman's steady gaze. Tell her that I am willing to learn whatever she thinks I should know. I may not be Apache, but I am not helpless. Nahasan spoke again, this time with what sounded like amusement in her voice. Ayana actually smiled as he translated. She says that willingness to learn is good, but learning requires surviving the teaching. Apache life is not gentle with those who cannot adapt quickly. I have survived crossing 200 miles of desert with limited water and constant danger, Sarah replied with quiet dignity. I have helped my family through drought, disease, and debt. I may not know Apache ways, but I know something about survival. The older woman nodded approvingly at Sarah's words, even before they were translated. Her experienced eyes seemed to recognize the steel beneath Sarah's feminine exterior, and her expression grew more thoughtful. Machete spoke up again, addressing Ayana directly. The war leader's tone suggested he was making recommendations about immediate, practical matters rather than philosophical. Questions about Sarah's character. Machete says we must move from this canyon before more soldiers come looking, Ayana explained. Captain Morrison will report the incident to his superiors, and they will want to investigate. We cannot stay in such an exposed position. Sarah realized that her presence was already changing Apache tactical considerations. The warriors would have to adjust their normal patterns to account for her slower pace and different needs. She was becoming a factor in decisions that could affect the safety of the entire band. Where will we go? She asked. To the hidden valley where our families wait, Ayana replied. It is a hard journey, especially for someone not used to Apache travel. You will ride with me until we know you can manage a horse on mountain trails. Nahasan spoke again, this time gesturing toward Sarah's dress and boots. The practical woman was clearly assessing what would need to be done to prepare a settler woman for Apache life in the wilderness. My mother says your clothes will not last 2 days in our country, Ayana translated with another slight smile. She will provide what you need to travel safely, but you must leave behind the things that mark you as a settler. Sarah looked down at her carefully maintained dress, her leather boots and the small bag containing her few precious possessions. These items represented her connection to her former life, her family, and her culture. Giving them up would be another step toward the unknown future she had chosen. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm ready to do whatever is necessary." As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the ancient pictographs, Sarah prepared to leave behind everything familiar and venture into a world she could barely imagine. The Apache warriors began making final preparations for departure, and she knew that once they left this place, there would be no turning back from the path she had chosen. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's life had changed forever in the sacred canyon. The hidden valley that served as the Apache camp was unlike anything she had ever seen. A natural fortress surrounded by towering red cliffs and accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended. Springs fed a clear stream that ran through the center of the valley, supporting cottonwood trees and providing water for the horses and the small community that called this place home. Sarah's transformation during those weeks had been both physical and emotional. Nahasan had indeed provided her with Apache clothing, including soft buckskin dresses decorated with traditional beadwork and sturdy moccasins that allowed her to move silently through the rocky terrain. Her once pale skin had been darkened by the desert sun, and her hands had grown calloused from the daily tasks of Apache life. Learning to live among the Apache had proven more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The language barrier made every interaction difficult, though she was beginning to understand basic words and phrases. More challenging still were the cultural differences that governed everything, from how food was prepared to how respect was shown to elders. Nahasan had taken charge of Sarah's education with the stern patience of a woman who had raised many children and taught many young women the skills necessary for survival. The lessons were practical and immediate: how to prepare traditional foods, how to treat animal hides, how to identify medicinal plants, and how to carry out the countless daily tasks that kept the community functioning. "Your hands are soft like a child's," Nahasan observed one morning as she watched Sarah struggling to scrape a deer hide. Her English had improved dramatically during their time together, though she still preferred to speak Apache when others were present. "Apache women learn these skills before they can walk properly. You must learn in days what takes years to master." Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. "I'm trying my best. Show me again how to hold the tool correctly." The older woman demonstrated the proper technique with hands that moved with the confidence of decades of practice. Better, but still too gentle. The hide does not respond to kindness. It responds to strength and persistence. Around them, the daily life of the Apache camp continued with its own rhythms and patterns. Children played games that taught them hunting and warfare skills while their mothers prepared food and maintained weapons. The men alternated between hunting expeditions and scouting missions, always alert for signs of military activity in the surrounding territories. Ayana had been away for 5 days on one such scouting mission, leading a small group to verify the information Sarah had provided about the planned military forts. His absence had given her time to establish relationships with other members of the community without the complication of his protective presence. Some of the Apache women had accepted her with cautious friendliness, appreciating her willingness to work hard and learn their ways. Others remained suspicious of her motives and background, wondering if her presence might bring danger to their families. The children were naturally curious about the strange woman who spoke their language poorly but smiled often. Nalnish, the young warrior who had initially opposed bringing Sarah to the camp, had gradually warmed to her presence. He often served as translator when Nahasan's patience ran short, and Sarah had begun to appreciate his dry sense of humor and quick intelligence. "White woman learns slowly," he would tease when she made mistakes, "but Apache babies learn faster than white woman." "Apache babies don't have to unlearn 20 years of different customs," Sarah would reply, which usually earned her a grudging smile from the young warrior. On the morning of the 4th week, a lookout's whistle echoed through the valley, signaling the return of Ayana's scouting party. Sarah felt her heart race as she saw the riders approaching, though she tried to hide her emotional reaction from the women working around her. Ayana looked tired and grim as he dismounted from his horse, his face bearing the dust and fatigue of hard travel. He spoke immediately with Machete and the other senior warriors, their conversation urgent and serious. Sarah continued working on the hide she was preparing, but her attention was focused on trying to understand what was being discussed. Finally, Ayanna approached the area where the women were working, his expression grave as he looked at Sarah. "Your information was accurate," he said without preamble. "We found soldiers surveying the locations you described. Construction materials are already being moved into position." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and dread. Her honesty had been proven, which would improve her standing in the community. But the confirmation of military plans meant that conflict was inevitable. "What will happen now?" she asked. "The council will meet tonight to decide our response," Ayanna replied. "Your knowledge has given us time to prepare, but the situation remains dangerous for all Apache people." Nahasan looked up from her work and spoke to her son in Apache. Their conversation was brief but intense, and Sarah caught enough words to understand they were discussing her role in the community's future plans. "My mother says that you have proven your value as a source of information about military activities," Ayanna translated. "But she asks whether you understand that helping Apache people means accepting that you can never return to your former life." The question struck Sarah with unexpected force. During the busy weeks of learning survival skills and adapting to Apache customs, she had not fully confronted the permanent nature of her situation. Her family believed she was a captive who might someday be ransomed or rescued. The reality was more complex and final. "I understand," she said quietly. "I made my choice in the canyon and I accept the consequences." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt a sharp pang of loss as she thought of her parents and siblings making their way toward California without her. Did they think of her every day as she thought of them? Were they safe? Had they found the new life they had sought? That evening, the entire Apache community gathered around a central fire for the council meeting. Sarah was given a place among the women, though she noticed that several men occasionally glanced in her direction when discussing military matters. Her unique knowledge of settler and military affairs had given her an unusual status in the community. The discussion was conducted entirely in Apache, with Nalnish providing quiet translation for Sarah when crucial points were being debated. The central question seemed to be whether to abandon the hidden valley and move deeper into the mountains, or to stay and fight for their traditional territory. Machete, the war leader, spoke passionately for aggressive action against the planned military installations. His scarred face was animated as he described tactics for disrupting construction and harassing supply lines. Several younger warriors voiced their agreement with his militant approach. Ayanna presented a more cautious perspective, arguing that direct confrontation with a well-equipped military force would result in heavy Apache casualties. He proposed a strategy of strategic withdrawal, combined with diplomatic overtures to territorial authorities. As the debate continued, Sarah realized that her presence had become a factor in their strategic calculations. Some warriors saw her as a valuable intelligence asset, who could provide ongoing information about military plans. Others worried that harboring a settler woman would provide enemies with justification for increased aggression against Apache communities. Finally, Nahasan stood and addressed the council. Her words carried the authority of age and wisdom, and the gathering fell silent as she spoke. Though Sarah could not understand all of her words, the older woman's tone suggested she was proposing a solution that addressed both practical and spiritual concerns. When Nahasan finished speaking, Ayanna rose and looked directly at Sarah. His expression was serious but not unkind as he prepared to translate his mother's words. "The council has reached a decision about your future among our people," he said. "But first you must answer a question that will determine everything that follows." The firelight danced across the faces of the assembled Apache community as Sarah stood before them, aware that her answer to Nahasan's question would determine not only her own fate but potentially the future relationship between her adopted people and the encroaching world of settlers and soldiers. Ayanna's voice was steady as he translated his mother's words. Nahasan asks, "When the soldiers come for you, as they surely will you go with them willingly to save Apache lives? Or will you ask us to die protecting someone who was never truly one of us?" The question struck Sarah like a physical blow. In her weeks among the Apache, she had grown to care deeply for these people who had accepted her when she had nowhere else to go. The thought of being the cause of their suffering or death was unbearable, But the question also forced her to confront the depth of her commitment to her new life. Sarah looked around the circle of faces watching her intently. She saw Nalnish, whose initial hostility had gradually transformed into protective friendship. She saw Machete, the scarred warrior whose respect she had earned through her accurate intelligence about military movements. She saw the women who had taught her essential survival skills with patient determination. Most importantly, she saw Ayanna, whose leadership had made her acceptance possible, and whose growing regard had become more precious to her than she had initially realized. The feelings developing between them had been unspoken but unmistakable, adding another layer of complexity to her impossible situation. "Before I answer," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air, "I want you all to understand something about my people that you may not know." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "Not all settlers are like Captain Morrison. Many are families like mine. People who have lost everything and are searching for a chance to rebuild their lives. They fear Apache warriors because they have heard terrible stories, just as you fear soldiers because you have suffered terrible losses." Murmurs arose from the assembled community as Ayanna translated her words. Sarah could see both understanding and skepticism in the faces around her. "But I have also learned something about Apache people that most settlers will never know," she continued. "You are not the savages that men like Morrison claim you are. You are a people fighting to protect your children, your traditions, and your land from forces that would destroy everything you hold sacred." Nahasan spoke briefly to her son, and Ayanna nodded before addressing Sarah again. "My mother asks what this has to do with her question about your choice when soldiers come." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would seal her fate. "It means that I choose to stay with the Apache people not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I have found a home worth defending. If soldiers come for me, I will not go willingly. I will stand with you and face whatever consequences follow." The reaction to her declaration was immediate and intense. Several warriors spoke at once, their voices mixing approval and concern. The women exchanged meaningful glances, and Sarah could see them reassessing their opinion of the settler woman who had seemed so foreign just weeks before. But it was Ayanna's reaction that mattered most to Sarah. His dark eyes searched her face as if trying to determine the sincerity of her commitment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone she had never heard before. "You understand that this choice cannot be undone? If you stay with us, you become Apache in all ways. Your former life ends completely. There will be no going back, no rescue, no return to your family." "I understand," Sarah replied, though her heart ached as she thought of her parents and siblings. "My family wanted a new life in a new land. I have found mine here with you." Nahasan stood and walked slowly to where Sarah was standing. The older woman reached out and touched Sarah's cheek gently, her weathered fingers tracing the lines that weeks of Apache life had etched around the younger woman's eyes. She spoke softly in Apache, her words carrying warmth and acceptance that transcended language barriers. Then she reached into her clothing and withdrew a small pendant made of turquoise and silver, worked in traditional Apache patterns. "She says you are no longer a captive or a guest," Ayanna translated, his voice thick with emotion. "She says you are her daughter now, and Apache daughters do not abandon their families when trouble comes." As Nahasan placed the pendant around Sarah's neck, the gathered community erupted in voices of approval and acceptance. The formal adoption ceremony would come later, but this moment marked Sarah's true transformation from outsider to member of the tribe. Machete stood and addressed the council, his scarred face showing satisfaction with the evening's developments. His words were firm and decisive as he outlined the military implications of Sarah's commitment. "Machete says that having an Apache woman who understands settler ways and speaks their language will be valuable in the conflicts to come," Ayanna explained. "You can help us understand our enemies and perhaps find ways to protect our people without destroying yours." The council meeting continued late into the night as practical matters were discussed and plans were made. Sarah found herself consulted on questions about settler behavior, military tactics, and the political situation in the territorial government. Her perspective as someone who had lived in both worlds was proving invaluable. As the fire burned lower and the community began to disperse, Ayanna approached Sarah with an expression that mixed relief with something deeper and more personal. "I am glad you chose to stay," he said simply. "The path ahead will be difficult, but we will face it together." Sarah looked up at him, seeing not just the Apache leader who had saved her life in the canyon, but the man who had become the center of her new world. "When you lifted your bow and said I was yours, did you know it would lead to this?" Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "Apache warriors learn to see possibilities that others miss. I saw courage in your eyes that day, and courage always finds its proper place eventually." Over the following months, Sarah's prediction about the complexity of the approaching conflict proved accurate. The military construction proceeded as scheduled, but Apache resistance was more organized and effective than the soldiers had anticipated. Sarah's intelligence about patrol routes and supply schedules enabled precise raids that disrupted operations without triggering the kind of massive retaliation that had destroyed other Apache communities. Her role as cultural interpreter also proved invaluable when opportunities arose for negotiation. Unlike military officers who saw only enemies to be defeated, Sarah could recognize when individual settlers might be approached as potential allies rather than inevitable opponents. The transformation was not without its painful moments. News of her family occasionally reached the Apache camp through their network of scouts and traders. She learned that her parents had successfully reached California and established a small farm near Sacramento. The knowledge that they were safe brought her comfort, but also reminded her of the life she had left behind forever. On a warm evening almost a year after her adoption into the tribe, Sarah sat beside the stream that ran through the hidden valley, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Ayanna joined her there, as had become their custom when the day's work was finished. "Do you ever regret your choice?" he asked, settling beside her on the smooth stones. Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain my family must have felt, thinking they had lost me. But I cannot regret finding a place where I belong, where my life has meaning beyond mere survival." Ayanna nodded, understanding the complexity of her feelings. Apache people believe that every person has a path that leads to their true purpose. Perhaps your path always led here, and the canyon was simply where you recognized it. As night fell over the valley, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as Sarah Martinez, a settler's daughter seeking a new life in California. She had become Sarah, daughter of Nahasan, wife of Ayanna, and a bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for conflict, but might yet find a path toward understanding. The pendant at her throat caught the last rays of sunlight, and she touched it gently, remembering the moment when she had truly become Apache. In choosing to protect the innocent rather than preserve her own safety, she had discovered not just a new identity, but a new understanding of what it meant to be truly free.